The defenders of Masada. When the last free Jews chose death over slavery. Prologue. The fortress in silence. Dawn had not yet broken over the Judean Desert. The air hung cold and still, carrying the scent of stone and ancient dust. Far below the plateau, in the pre-dawn darkness, 15,000 Roman soldiers stirred in their 8 camps, leather creaking, metal scraping softly against metal. They had been here for months, building, waiting, preparing for what would come when the sun rose. But atop the mountain fortress of Masada, there was only silence. The kind of silence that presses against the ears. The kind that makes a man's heart pound louder in his chest. The kind that comes when something sacred or something terrible has just occurred. Roman sentries stared upward at the fortress walls, barely visible in the fading starlight. They had watched the wooden barrier burn hours ago, flames licking against the night sky, consuming the last defense the Jews had managed to construct. Their general, Lucius Flavius Silva, had made the decision to wait, to let the defenders spend one more night contemplating what the morning would bring. Capture, slavery, public execution in Rome, the fate of all who defied the empire. But as the eastern horizon began to blush with the first hint of dawn, as the desert slowly transformed from black to deep purple to dusty rose, something felt wrong. The fortress was too quiet. No movement on the walls, no voices carrying down from above, no preparation for the final battle everyone knew must come. The Roman siege tower sat at the top of the massive earthen ramp, its iron-sheathed bulk poised like a predator at the throat of its prey. Soon legionaries would pour through the breach in the wall, swords drawn, shields locked, ready to crush the last pocket of Jewish resistance in all of Judea. But the defenders would not be waiting. What the Romans would find when they entered Masada would shake even these hardened veterans of countless campaigns. They would discover not a battle, but a message. Not surrender, but defiance of a kind they had never witnessed. They would find 960 people who had looked into the face of Rome's overwhelming might and made a choice that echoed through the centuries. This is the story of how they came to stand on that mountain, of the world that shaped them, the fortress that sheltered them, and the impossible decision they faced when the walls finally fell. This is the story of Masada, not as myth, but as history, not as legend, but as truth, complicated and profound. This is the story of the last defenders who refused to kneel. The world before the storm. To understand why nearly 1,000 people would make the choice they did on that April night in 73 CE, you must first understand the world that forged them. Judea had known foreign occupation before. The Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks. Each empire had left its mark, but none had ground so relentlessly against Jewish life and faith as Rome. It began in 63 BCE when Pompey the Great marched his legions into Jerusalem, settling a succession dispute between Hasmonean brothers. Rome did what Rome always did. It took control, first through puppet kings, then through direct rule. What followed was a slow, inexorable tightening of the imperial grip. By 6 CE, Judea had become a Roman province, and with provincial status came the procurators. These governors, appointed by Rome, had one primary responsibility: extract wealth from the land and send it back to the empire. Whatever they collected beyond their quota, they could keep. The system practically guaranteed corruption. Imagine living under that reality. Taxes layered upon taxes, assessments that seemed designed to break you, soldiers who treated your holy sites with contempt, officials who cared nothing for your laws, your customs, your God. For 60 years, the Jewish people watched their wealth flow out of Judea and into Roman coffers, into Italian estates, into legionary camps on distant frontiers. The land grew poorer. Peasant farmers who had worked the same soil for generations found themselves mortgaging their land, then losing it entirely. Jerusalem swelled with the displaced and the desperate, When Herod the Great's massive renovation of the temple was finally completed in 63 CE, thousands of artisans and laborers suddenly had no work. Desperation breeds many things. Sometimes it breeds revolution. But the economic pressure was only part of the story. Deeper currents ran through Jewish society. Currents of faith and identity, of prophecy and expectation. The people remembered their past. They remembered the Maccabees, who had risen against impossible odds 2 centuries earlier and won. They remembered King David, who had slain Goliath. They remembered Moses, who had broken Pharaoh's power. And they remembered the promises. Prophecies speaking of a day when God would intervene, when a Messiah would come, when the yoke of foreign rule would finally be shattered. Hope can sustain a people through decades of oppression. But hope can also become something sharper, something more dangerous. It can become conviction, certainty, the belief that the moment is now. Various groups emerged to carry this conviction forward. The Pharisees sought to preserve Jewish law and practice through meticulous observance. The Sadducees, drawn from the priestly aristocracy, tried to maintain stability through cooperation with Rome. The Essenes withdrew into the wilderness, seeking purity away from a corrupted world. And then there were the Zealots, those consumed with zealotry for God and for freedom. They believed that foreign rule over God's chosen people was not just political oppression, but theological blasphemy. To serve Rome was to serve a false master. There could be only one Lord, and his name was not Caesar. From this ideological foundation emerged the Sicarii, the most extreme of all Jewish resistance movements. Their name came from the Latin word for a short, curved dagger, the sica, which they concealed beneath their robes. The Romans had used the term before to describe assassins, and it fit. The Sicarii believed in direct action. They moved through crowded festivals, through marketplaces, through the very courts of the temple itself, daggers hidden, waiting for their moment. A quick strike, a collaborator falls, the crowd scatters, and the assassin melts away, just another pilgrim, just another face in Jerusalem's teeming streets. But they did more than kill. They kidnapped, they raided, they struck fear into anyone they deemed complicit with Roman rule, and their definition of complicity was broad. Jewish leaders who counseled peace, wealthy landowners who paid their taxes without protest, anyone who seemed to accept the occupation as a permanent reality. The Sicarii were not freedom fighters in any romantic sense. Historical sources, primarily the Jewish historian Josephus, paint them as fanatics whose violence fell as heavily on their own people as on the Romans. During the siege of Jerusalem, when food supplies were desperately needed, the Sicarii reportedly burned massive grain stores to force the population to fight rather than negotiate. The same sources claim they massacred 700 women and children in the Jewish settlement of Ein Gedi when raiding for supplies. These are uncomfortable facts. The defenders of Masada were not simple heroes. They were complex, flawed human beings shaped by extraordinary circumstances. They were zealots in every sense of the word, consumed by their cause, willing to sacrifice not just themselves, but others to that cause, operating with a certainty that bordered on, or crossed into, fanaticism. Yet understanding this does not diminish the significance of their final stand. If anything, it makes it more profound. These were not mythical warriors. They were real people caught in the crushing machinery of imperial power who had watched their world burn and found themselves driven to extremes we can barely fathom. And at the center of this movement, descended from a line of rebels that stretched back decades, was a man named Eleazar ben Yair, Herod's eagle's nest. Long before the Sicarii ever set foot on its summit, Masada was a monument to a different kind of paranoia. Herod the Great, king of Judea from 37 to 4 BCE, was a man who understood that power required not just strength, but preparation. Appointed by Rome to rule the Jews, despite being Idumean by birth and therefore viewed as foreign by many of his subjects, Herod spent his reign looking over his shoulder. He feared his own family. He feared his subjects. He feared that the favor Rome had granted him could be just as easily withdrawn. So he built. He built on a scale that staggered the imagination. The massive expansion of the temple in Jerusalem, the port city of Caesarea, the fortress palaces of Herodium and Machaerus. Each project was both a demonstration of his power and a potential refuge should that power turn against him. But of all his constructions, Masada was the most audacious. The site itself was a gift of geology, a massive plateau of stone, rising more than 1,300 feet above the western shore of the Dead Sea, its cliffs falling away in sheer drops on every side. The heat here was merciless in summer, the wind bitter in winter, and water was as scarce as mercy in a Roman prison. Yet Herod looked at this desolate rock and saw possibility. Between 37 and 31 BCE, thousands of laborers hauled materials up narrow, winding paths that twisted and turned like snakes up the mountainside. They carved into living rock. They built where building seemed impossible. The result was extraordinary. The northern palace, called the Hanging Palace, because it was built across 3 natural terraces on the very edge of the northern cliff, was a masterpiece of both engineering and ostentation. The upper terrace contained Herod's private chambers, rooms paved with black and white mosaics in geometric patterns, walls adorned with frescoes in the Roman style. From a semicircular balcony with 2 concentric rows of columns, Herod could gaze out at the Dead Sea shimmering far below, at the Judean Desert stretching to the horizon, at an empire that seemed to belong to him alone. The middle and lower terraces were designed for entertainment and relaxation. More columns, more frescoes, more declarations in stone that the king who built this could command even the desert itself. But Masada was more than luxury. It was survival. The Western Palace, much larger, served as the administrative center. Its rooms surrounded a central courtyard, with quarters for Herod and his court, service areas, workshops, and storerooms. These storerooms were crucial, vast chambers stocked with enough food, wine, and oil to sustain a community for years. Herod had prepared for the possibility of a prolonged siege. Then there was the water system, a triumph of ancient engineering. In a land where water was life, Masada had none naturally occurring on its summit. Herod's builders carved enormous cisterns into the rock at the base of the mountain, capable of holding 40,000 cubic meters of water. During the brief winter rains, an ingenious system of channels and dams would capture every drop of runoff from the surrounding wadis and direct it into these cisterns. From there, the water could be hauled up to additional cisterns built into the cliff face, and finally to the fortress itself. A single day's rainfall, properly captured, could sustain over 1,000 people for 2 to 3 years. Around the entire plateau, Herod's engineers constructed a casemate wall, 2 parallel walls with rooms built into the space between them. The wall ran for nearly a mile, stood 18 feet high, and was studded with defensive towers at regular intervals. 4 gates, each heavily fortified, controlled access to the fortress. 3 narrow paths led from the base of the mountain to these gates. The eastern approach, called the snake path for obvious reasons, zigzagged up the cliff face in a series of switchbacks so steep and exposed that attackers could only climb single file, perfect targets for defenders above. The western approach was shorter but no less treacherous. The paths were natural choke points, easily defensible. Masada was, in every sense, impregnable, or it should have been. When Herod died in 4 BCE, his kingdom was divided among his sons, and eventually, Judea fell under direct Roman rule. For decades, Masada served as a garrison for a small detachment of Roman soldiers, a remote posting in an unforgiving landscape. The soldiers maintained the fortress, kept the cisterns clean, and watched the desert. Mostly, they waited for nothing to happen. They were not prepared for what came in 66 CE, the spark that ignited the inferno. The breaking point, when it came, seemed almost trivial. In the spring of 66 CE, the Roman procurator Gessius Florus, widely regarded as corrupt even by the standards of his office, ordered 17 talents of silver seized from the temple treasury in Jerusalem. Officially, It was for back taxes. Practically, it was theft. The people of Jerusalem were outraged. Some mocking youths passed around a collection basket, making a show of gathering coins. For the poor procurator Florus. It was a joke, a small act of defiance. Florus did not laugh. He demanded that the mockers be identified and punished. When they could not be found, likely hidden by sympathizers, Florus ordered his soldiers into the city. They arrested random citizens, dragged them before him, and had them crucified. Not one or two, hundreds. Men and women, some of them from the upper classes, executed without trial for someone else's joke. Jerusalem erupted. Riots spread through the streets. Florus responded with more force, which only threw fuel on the fire. The Jewish king Agrippa II, a client of Rome, tried to calm the situation. He urged the people to submit, to pay the taxes, to avoid the catastrophe that open rebellion would bring. He was shouted down. The crowd drove him from the city. In August 66 CE, Eleazar ben Hananiah, the captain of the temple guard, made a decision that crossed a line from which there could be no return. He ordered the cessation of the daily sacrifices offered on behalf of the Roman emperor. It was more than a religious statement. It was a declaration of war. What followed was chaos. The Roman garrison in Jerusalem, caught off guard, was overwhelmed and slaughtered. Across Judea, old tensions between Jewish and Greek populations exploded into ethnic violence. Jewish rebels seized fortresses. Greek citizens massacred Jewish communities. Jewish forces retaliated. The province descended into a spiral of violence that fed on itself, each atrocity justifying the next. Into this maelstrom came a man named Menahem, a leader of the Sicarii, and likely a relative of Judah the Galilean, who had led a revolt against Rome 60 years earlier. Menahem understood that symbols mattered. He needed weapons, and he needed a dramatic statement. So he marched south to Masada. The Roman garrison stationed there likely numbered only a few dozen soldiers. They were isolated, far from reinforcements, guarding a fortress that had seen no action in living memory. When Menahem and his followers arrived, using stealth and speed, they overwhelmed the garrison completely. Ancient sources say the Sicarii killed every Roman soldier they found, 700 men, though that number is disputed by modern historians as likely inflated. Regardless of the exact count, Masada was now in Jewish hands, and more importantly, Herod's armories were theirs. Swords, spears, armor stored for decades in the dry desert air, weapons enough to equip an army. Menahem took what he needed and returned to Jerusalem in triumph. But triumph in rebellion is fleeting. The initial Jewish victories created a dangerous illusion. When the Syrian governor Cestius Gallus marched on Jerusalem with a full legion, the 12th Fulminata, and was ambushed and routed at the pass of Beth Horon, many Jews began to believe the impossible, that they could actually defeat Rome. They were wrong. Rome did not forgive defeats. Rome did not forget humiliations. The Jewish rebels had humbled a legion and killed its commander. Rome's response would be overwhelming and absolute. Emperor Nero appointed Vespasian, one of Rome's most experienced generals, to crush the rebellion. Vespasian brought with him his son, Titus, and 3 full legions, the 5th Macedonica, the 10th Fretensis, and the 15th Apollinaris, along with numerous auxiliary units. 60,000 heavily armed, professionally trained soldiers marched into Galilee in 67 CE. The slaughter that followed was methodical. Vespasian was not interested in quick victories. He was interested in complete victories. One by one, the fortified cities of Galilee fell. Jotapata, commanded by a young leader named Josephus, held out for 47 days before being stormed. Josephus himself survived by surrendering to the Romans, a decision that would make him a reviled traitor to many Jews, but also preserve him to become the primary historian of the war. Tarichiah fell. Gamla fell. An estimated 100,000 Jews were killed or sold into slavery. The survivors fled south, many to Jerusalem, bringing with them stories of Roman efficiency and death. And back in Jerusalem, the rebel factions did something almost incomprehensible. They turned on each other. Three main groups fought for control of the city. The Zealots under Eleazar ben Simon held the inner temple courts. John of Gishala controlled the outer courts and parts of the city. Simon bar Giora commanded the lower city and sections of the walls. Instead of uniting against the approaching Roman army, they waged a bitter civil war. Moderate leaders who counseled negotiation were killed, not by Romans, but by fellow Jews. Food supplies that could have sustained the city for years were burned by one faction to force the others to fight, rather than wait out a siege. The Talmud would later say that Jerusalem fell not because of Roman military superiority, but because of causeless hatred, sinat kinam, among the Jews themselves. Meanwhile, Menahem had returned to Jerusalem after his triumph at Masada, apparently believing he could unite the rebellion under his leadership. He was wrong. Rival factions turned on him, and he was captured, tortured, and executed, along with many of his followers. But not all. A relative of Menahem named Eleazar ben Yair escaped the slaughter and fled back to Masada with a group of survivors. There, high on their mountain fortress, they could watch the world burn from a distance. For a while. Eleazar ben Yair, the man who would not kneel. We know far less about Eleazar ben Yair than we would like. Our primary source is Josephus, and Josephus had complicated feelings about the Sicarii. He called them bandits, zealots, and worse. Yet, when describing the final days at Masada, his tone shifts. There is something in his account, admiration perhaps, or recognition of a terrible kind of courage that he himself had lacked when faced with a similar choice at Jotapata. What we know with reasonable certainty, Eleazar was a descendant of Judah the Galilean, founder of what Josephus called the Fourth Philosophy, a movement that rejected any human kingship over Jews, holding that only God could legitimately rule his chosen people. This was not merely political ideology, it was theology made into revolution. Judah the Galilean had risen in revolt against Rome in 6 CE, when the census was ordered for taxation purposes. The revolt was crushed, Judah was killed, and the ideology should have died with him. But it did not. It passed to his sons, to his relatives, to those who believed as he did that submission to Caesar was submission to evil. Eleazar inherited not just blood but conviction. By the time he became the leader at Masada, probably in his 40s or 50s, he had spent a lifetime in resistance. He had seen Rome's power up close. He had witnessed Roman brutality. He had participated in the Sicarii' campaign of assassination and terror against both Romans and Jews they deemed collaborators. He was not a simple man. The sources paint him as intelligent, eloquent, capable of swaying crowds with his words. But he was also capable of ordering raids against fellow Jews who refused to support the revolt. He was a true believer, which made him both inspiring and dangerous. After Menahem's death in Jerusalem, Eleazar led the surviving Sicarii back to Masada. This was no random retreat. Masada represented something symbolic. It was the stronghold they had taken from Rome at the war's beginning. It was provisioned to last for years. It was, quite literally, a fortress that could not be taken by storm. Or so it seemed. The years between 66 and 72 CE at Masada remain somewhat mysterious. We know the Sicarii used it as a base for raids into the surrounding countryside. We know they were joined by other Jewish families, fleeing the destruction of Jerusalem. We know the fortress became not just a military outpost but a community, men, women, children, the elderly, all living under the desert sun in Herod's abandoned palaces, maintaining the cisterns, keeping watch, and waiting. Josephus claims the Sicarii raided the Jewish settlement of Ein-Gedi, massacring 700 people. If true, and many modern historians are skeptical of such specific numbers, it reveals the moral complexity of the defenders. These were not innocent victims. They had done terrible things in the name of their cause. But neither were they the simple bandits Josephus sometimes painted them as. They were believers. Fanatics, yes, but fanatics who understood precisely what they had chosen. They could have fled to Egypt. They could have submitted. They could have tried to blend back into the population and disappear. Instead, they stayed on their mountain and defied the most powerful empire in the known world. Eleazar knew, he must have known, that it could only end one way. Rome did not leave rebellions unpunished. Rome did not forget. After the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE and the destruction of the temple, after Vespasian had become emperor and Titus had celebrated his triumph in Rome, the legions would turn their attention to the last pockets of resistance. Herodium fell quickly. Machaerus surrendered after negotiation. That left only Masada, and Masada would not surrender. Eleazar seems to have made that decision early. Perhaps it was ideology, the conviction that submission was unthinkable. Perhaps it was practical, the knowledge of what Rome did to rebel leaders. Perhaps it was simply stubbornness, the refusal to admit that everything they had fought for was lost. Or perhaps it was something else. Perhaps Eleazar understood that sometimes the most powerful resistance is not the one that wins, but the one that refuses to submit, even in the face of certain defeat. Perhaps he understood that the choice they would eventually make would echo down through the centuries longer than any battle victory. We will never know his thoughts. We have only his reported final speeches, filtered through Josephus, possibly reconstructed or even invented. But what we do know is this. When the Romans came, Eleazar did not run. When the walls were breached, he did not surrender. And when the choice came between slavery and death, he convinced nearly 1,000 people to choose death. That is leadership of a terrible, tragic kind. Jerusalem's fall. The world catches fire. April 14, 70 CE. The date matters because it fell during Passover, the holiest of festivals, when Jewish pilgrims from across the diaspora crowded into Jerusalem to celebrate their ancestors' liberation from bondage in Egypt. Instead, they found themselves trapped inside a city becoming a tomb. Titus had brought 4 full legions to Jerusalem, the 5th, 10th, 12th, and 15th, plus numerous auxiliary units. 60,000 Roman soldiers encircled the city, and they were in no hurry. They built circumvallation walls to prevent escape or resupply. They constructed siege towers and brought up massive battering rams, and they waited for starvation to do their work for them. Inside the city, the situation was catastrophic. The food stores that should have sustained the population for years had been burned by the rival Jewish factions in their mad civil war. Starvation set in quickly. Josephus describes scenes of horror. Mothers eating their own children, families murdering each other over scraps of food, people dying in the streets by the thousands. Anyone who tried to escape was caught by the Romans and crucified within sight of the city walls. 500 a day at the height of the siege, so many that the Romans ran out of wood for crosses. The crucified hung there, rotting warnings of what awaited those who defied Rome. The defenders fought with desperate courage. They made sorties against the siege works, setting fire to the Roman towers. They fought from the walls even as battering rams pounded them to rubble. They retreated from the outer walls to the inner temple courts and fought on. But Rome was inevitable. By July, the Romans had battered their way through multiple defensive walls. They controlled most of the city. Only the Temple Mount remained in Jewish hands. Titus, according to Josephus, did not want to destroy the temple. It was, after all, a marvel of architecture and a holy site. He wanted to preserve it, but battle has its own momentum. During the final assault on the temple courts, a Roman soldier threw a burning brand through a window. The fire caught. It spread. Soon, the entire structure was engulfed in flames. The defenders fought on, even as the roof collapsed around them. The gold-plated walls melted in the heat. The treasures of centuries, scrolls, sacred vessels, the accumulated history of a people, burned to ash. The Second Temple, the center of Jewish religious life, was gone. The slaughter that followed was comprehensive. Josephus claims over 1 million Jews died during the siege, though modern historians consider this number inflated. Likely hundreds of thousands, which is horror enough. Thousands more were taken as slaves. 70,000 would later be transported to Rome to build the Colosseum, working until they died under the Roman sun. The city itself was demolished. Titus ordered that Jerusalem be razed to its foundations, with only 3 towers left standing as monuments to its former strength. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who defy Rome. News of Jerusalem's fall spread quickly through the remaining pockets of resistance. For Eleazar and the defenders of Masada, watching from their mountain plateau, a day's journey to the southeast, the smoke rising from Jerusalem would have been visible on the horizon. They knew what it meant. They were alone now. The last free Jews in all of Judea. The Roman legions would come for them soon enough. And when they came, there would be nowhere left to run. The last free Jews. Life on Masada in the years following Jerusalem's fall existed in a strange kind of limbo. Part normalcy, part desperation, part defiance. 960 people, according to Josephus's count. Men who had fought in the war, women who had fled the destruction of Jerusalem, children born into rebellion who had never known peace, elderly who had seen their world crumble and chose to end their days on a fortress rather than in chains. They were not an army. They were a community, clinging to existence on a rock in the desert. The Sicarii modified Herod's luxurious structures to serve their needs. The northern palace, once a showcase of royal extravagance, became living quarters for multiple families. The western palace's grand rooms were repurposed into communal spaces. The storehouses that Herod had filled with delicacies now held more practical provisions. But they did more than just survive. They lived. Archaeological excavations in the 1960s revealed that the Sicarii constructed a synagogue on Masada, one of the oldest ever discovered. It was simple, functional, built into one of the casemate wall chambers. They created ritual baths, mikvahs, according to Jewish law. They maintained religious observances even in this most extreme of circumstances. Think about what that means. These were people who could have spent every waking hour preparing for the Roman attack they knew was coming. Instead, they built places to pray. They maintained purity laws. They kept the Sabbath. They raised their children in the faith they were willing to die for. They also raided. The defenders could not be entirely self-sufficient. They needed supplies the fortress could not provide. So they ventured out, striking at settlements in the region. The raid on En-Gedi remains controversial. Josephus's account of 700 dead is stark and damning. Modern historians debate its accuracy and whether all those who died were combatants or civilians. But even if we discount the specific numbers, the fact remains. The Sicarii took what they needed from those who would not join their cause. This was not Robin Hood stealing from the rich to give to the poor. This was survival in its rawest form, stripped of mercy. The defenders were not perfect. They were human beings in impossible circumstances, making choices that balanced idealism with desperation, faith with pragmatism. They were zealots and families, warriors and children, believers and survivors, all living together on a mountain that was both fortress and prison. Eleazar ben Yair commanded them. But command on Masada was likely more complicated than simple military hierarchy. These were not just soldiers following orders. They were people who had chosen this path, who stayed when they could have fled, who believed, each in their own way, that what they were doing mattered. They kept watch from the walls, scanning the horizon for the dust clouds that would signal Rome's approach. They maintained the cisterns, ensuring the precious water supply stayed clean and available. They rationed food carefully, knowing that the stores, vast as they were, would not last forever. And they waited. The waiting must have been hardest on the children. Imagine growing up on Masada, playing in the ruins of a dead king's palace, never knowing anything but the fortress and the desert, and the constant awareness that enemies surrounded you. Imagine being told stories of Jerusalem, of the temple, of a world that existed before the war, a world you would never see. Some sources suggest that not everyone on Masada was Sicarii. Some may have been zealots who joined after Jerusalem's fall. Some may have been refugees with nowhere else to go, choosing the fortress because at least it was free, rather than out of ideological conviction. The community was likely more diverse than simple labels suggest. But regardless of their individual motivations, they were united by one reality. They were the last Jews in Judea living free from Roman rule, the last to practice their faith without bowing to an emperor's image, the last who had not submitted. That distinction was both their identity and their sentence, because Rome was patient, but Rome was coming. Rome's iron fist. Flavius Silva. Lucius Flavius Silva Nonius Bassus, to give him his full name, was the kind of man Rome produced regularly and efficiently. Capable, methodical, utterly reliable. Appointed governor of Judea in 72 CE, Silva inherited a province still smoldering from the rebellion. Most of the fighting was over. Jerusalem lay in ruins. The major fortresses had fallen or surrendered. The land was quiet, if not quite peaceful. Except for Masada. Silva could have ignored it. 960 people on a remote desert plateau posed no real military threat to Roman control of Judea. They could not attack anything significant. They could not inspire new revolt. They were isolated, surrounded by hundreds of miles of desert, slowly consuming their finite supplies. They were irrelevant, except they were not. Silva understood what many modern observers miss. Masada was not about military necessity, it was about message. As long as those Jews held their fortress, as long as they flew their banners and proclaimed their freedom, they were a living symbol that Rome could be defied. Every day they remained independent was a day that undermined Roman authority throughout the province. Empires cannot afford to leave such symbols standing. So Silva assembled his forces. The 10th Legion Fretensis, the Strait of Messina Legion, would form the core. These were veterans, many of whom had fought in the siege of Jerusalem. They knew their business. Silva added auxiliary units, cavalry, and crucially, thousands of Jewish prisoners of war who would serve as forced laborers. 15,000 total, perhaps slightly fewer, though ancient sources vary. Regardless of the exact number, it was an overwhelming force, sent to crush fewer than 1,000 defenders. Silva was not a man given to grand gestures or unnecessary cruelty. He was an engineer, solving a problem. The problem was how to take a fortress perched on a mountain, with cliffs falling away 1,300 feet on one side and 300 on the other. Accessible only by narrow paths, easily defended, supplied with years of food and water, garrisoned by people who had already demonstrated they would fight to the last. The solution was Roman, systematic, thorough, brutal in its efficiency. First, complete the encirclement. Silva ordered the construction of a circumvallation wall around the entire base of Masada. His engineers surveyed, measured, and planned. Then thousands of legionaries and prisoners hauled stones and built. The wall ran for 2.5 miles, stood 6.5 feet thick and 8 feet high, with towers and fortified camps positioned at regular intervals. It took about 2 weeks to complete. 2 weeks to seal Masada off completely from any outside assistance or resupply. Then came the camps. 8 in total, built according to standard Roman military design. Rectangular fortifications with defined quarters, command posts, storage areas, and defensive perimeters. Each camp connected to the main wall. Each was positioned to cover potential escape routes. The whole system was a textbook example of Roman siegecraft. But the real engineering marvel was still to come. On the western side of Masada, where the cliffs were somewhat less sheer, only about 300 feet, Silva found a natural ridge of bedrock that extended partway up the mountain. It was not quite what he needed, but it was close enough. He would build a ramp, not a small ramp, not a temporary structure, a massive earthen siege ramp that would rise 200 feet from the existing bedrock spur to reach the fortress walls. It would need to be wide enough and solid enough to support a siege tower weighing tons, carrying battering rams and hundreds of soldiers. The task was staggering. Silva's engineers calculated they would need to move roughly 500,000 tons of earth and stone in the desert, under the burning sun, while under constant fire from defenders above. And they would use Jewish prisoners as the primary labor force. Think about the cruelty of that decision. Jews forced to build the ramp that would enable the destruction of the last Jewish stronghold. Families compelled to construct the instrument of their own people's defeat. If any refused, they would be killed. If they worked too slowly, they would be beaten. They had no choice but to participate in the end of their own resistance. Silva's plan was not just militarily effective, it was psychologically devastating. From the walls of Masada, the defenders watched the ramp grow. Day by day, they could see their doom taking shape. They fired arrows and hurled stones at the workers, but it made little difference. Silva had his soldiers raise protective barriers. The work continued. The ramp took months to complete, 2 to 3 months of back-breaking labor, of earth and stones hauled, basket by basket, layer by layer, compacted and reinforced with timber. When it was finished, it stretched 1,968 feet in length and rose 200 feet to meet the fortress wall. Then Silva ordered the construction of the siege tower. This was no simple wooden structure. It was a mobile fortress in itself, rising multiple stories high, plated with iron to protect against fire arrows. Inside, it carried a massive battering ram, capable of smashing through stone walls. It carried rapid-firing catapults to clear the defenders from the ramparts. It carried soldiers, ready to pour through any breach. The tower was hauled up the ramp by hundreds of men and animals, a monument to Roman engineering and imperial determination. When it reached the top and was positioned against Masada's wall, Silva sent his terms: surrender or die. Eleazar's answer came in the form of continued resistance. So Silva gave the order. The battering ram swung. Again and again. The stone wall cracked, fractured. Finally, a breach opened wide enough for troops to enter. The Romans poured through and found a second wall. The defenders had known the outer wall would not hold, so they had built an inner barrier using the only materials they had in abundance: timber from Herod's palaces. They had constructed a wall of wooden beams and earthfill behind the stone wall. When the battering ram finally broke through, it faced a wall that the ram could not easily damage. Silva was briefly stymied. Then he had a thought. Wood burns. He ordered fire arrows loosed into the wooden wall. The timber caught quickly in the dry desert air. Flames spread. The defenders tried to douse them, but the fire was too intense. Within hours, the wooden wall was consumed. Now there was only empty air between the Romans and the defenders. Silva made one final decision. It was late in the day. His soldiers were tired from the assault. The fortress was burning in places, smoke obscuring visibility. He could order the final attack now, fighting through fire and smoke in an unknown interior against desperate defenders. Or he could wait until morning, let the fire burn out overnight, and attack with fresh troops in daylight. He chose patience. The legions withdrew to their camps. Guards were posted to ensure no one escaped. The fortress burned through the night, flames visible for miles across the desert. And on Masada, Eleazar ben Yair faced a choice. By morning, the Romans would come. There would be no escape, no miracle, no relief force, only capture, slavery, or death. The siege, engineering against will. The mathematics of the siege were brutal in their simplicity. 15,000 Romans surrounding fewer than 1,000 Jews. Unlimited resources flowing to Silva's camps from across the empire. Food, weapons, timber, slaves. While Masada's defenders consumed finite stores that diminished daily. Professional soldiers who could rotate shifts, rest in camps, and maintain strength over months. Against defenders who could never relax, never leave the walls unguarded, never stop watching for the next phase of Rome's methodical advance. It was not a question of if Rome would win, only when and at what cost. Silva approached the siege as he would any engineering project. First, establish complete control. The circumvallation wall ensured no supplies could reach the fortress, no reinforcements could arrive. And perhaps most importantly, no news of Roman preparations could escape to inspire other resistance elsewhere in the province. The wall itself demonstrated Roman efficiency. It followed the natural contours of the terrain, incorporating existing defensive features where possible, built solidly where necessary. The towers placed along its length gave Silva's troops commanding views of both the fortress above and the desert beyond. Any movement would be spotted. Any attempt to escape would be met with arrows or pursuit. The 8 camps formed a ring of Roman presence around Masada's base. Each camp housed hundreds of soldiers with access to food, water, brought by pack animals from cisterns miles away, medical care, and rotation schedules that kept troops fresh. The camps were not temporary shelters, but proper fortifications that could be defended if needed, though no attack came. The defenders on Masada had no way to assault camps surrounded by thousands of armed legionaries. Archaeological work in recent decades has revealed just how complete these siege works were. The circumvallation wall's remains can still be traced around the mountain. The foundations of the camps are visible, their rectangular outlines clear against the desert floor. The siege ramp, still standing after nearly 2,000 years, is one of the most intact examples of Roman military engineering anywhere in the world. The defenders could only watch and wait. They had advantages, to be sure. The cisterns were full. Herod's storehouses still contained grain, oil, wine, dates, dried meat. The walls were strong. The approaches were treacherous for attackers. If this had been the classical siege, Romans outside trying to starve defenders into submission, Masada could have held for years. But Silva was not trying to starve them out. He was building the means to assault them directly. The construction of the ramp was visible from the fortress walls, impossible to ignore. Each day it grew higher. Each day the Roman engineers moved it closer. The defenders must have held councils, debated options, considered counterattacks. Could they destroy the ramp? They tried, firing flaming arrows at the wooden supports. But Silva had planned for this. The lower levels were primarily earth and stone. The timber reinforcements were protected by barriers and could be quickly replaced if damaged. Could they sally out and attack the workers? Possible, but suicidal. The narrow paths down from Masada would become death traps if Roman forces counterattacked. Any sally would leave the fortress undermanned and vulnerable. And even if they managed to kill some workers, Silva had thousands more. Could they negotiate? Perhaps offer to simply leave peacefully, abandoning the fortress in exchange for safe passage. We have no record that such an offer was made, probably because both sides knew it was impossible. Rome did not negotiate with rebels. Rome punished them, and the Sicarii ideology made submission unthinkable. The entire point of their stand was to refuse to submit, so they prepared. We know from archaeological evidence that the defenders modified structures within Masada during these final months. They converted buildings for military purposes. They stockpiled weapons, arrows, spears, stones to hurl from the walls. They strengthened defensive positions, and they watched the ramp grow. The psychological impact must have been overwhelming. Day after day, watching your execution being constructed, knowing that every foot of progress brought the moment of reckoning closer, seeing Jewish prisoners, people who might be relatives, neighbors, fellow Jews, forced to labor on the instrument of your destruction. Some historians have questioned why the defenders did not attempt more aggressive counterattacks against the ramp construction. Josephus's account mentions no major sorties, no desperate attempts to destroy the work. This seems strange, almost passive, for a group as militant as the Sicarii. Several explanations have been proposed. Perhaps they recognized the futility of such attacks. Perhaps they were conserving their strength for the final battle. Perhaps they were already contemplating a different kind of ending, one where the ramp itself became irrelevant. Or perhaps Josephus, writing for a Roman audience, simply did not record attacks that did occur. His account is the only one we have, and it has its biases. What we know for certain is that after months of work, the ramp was completed. The siege tower was constructed and dragged into position. The battering ram began its work on the morning chosen by Silva. The stone wall cracked after hours of pounding. The breach opened. Romans surged forward and found the wooden wall the defenders had built behind the stone. This was clever. The defenders knew the outer wall would fail, so they built a backup using the only material they had in abundance. Timber beams from Herod's palaces, earth-filled to absorb impact. A wall that bent rather than breaking under the ram's blows. Silva adapted. If the wall was wood, then fire was the answer. Fire arrows flew. The timber caught. The wind that afternoon blew from the northwest, driving flames deeper into the wooden wall, making it impossible to extinguish. Hours later, only ash remained. Now Masada was open. Silva could have ordered the assault immediately. His troops were ready. The fortress was breached. But he looked at the situation with a commander's calculation. Late in the day, smoke obscuring the interior, unfamiliar terrain, defenders who had nothing to lose. He chose to wait, not out of mercy, not out of uncertainty, simply out of tactical prudence. Better to attack in the morning with fresh troops and clear visibility than to risk unnecessary casualties in what would be a difficult interior assault regardless. So the Romans withdrew. Guards were doubled to prevent escape, and inside Masada, Eleazar ben Yair gathered his people for the hardest council they would ever face. The breach, when walls fall. April 16, 73 CE. Evening. The wooden wall was burning itself out, flames still licking at remaining timbers, smoke drifting across the fortress interior. From the walls, the defenders could see the Roman camps settling in for the night. Cooking fires, soldiers taking their ease, the casual confidence of men who know victory is assured. Tomorrow, the legionaries would come. They would form up in the pre-dawn darkness, armor checked, swords sharpened, shields locked. They would march up the siege ramp in formation, disciplined and deadly. They would pour through the breach, sweeping aside whatever resistance remained. And then it would be over. The defenders of Masada had fought for 7 years. They had survived the fall of Jerusalem. They had raided, resisted, and held their fortress against the most powerful empire in human history. They had proven something, though what exactly remained unclear even to them. Now they faced the end. Eleazar called his people together. Where exactly this gathering occurred we do not know. Perhaps in the synagogue, perhaps in one of the palace courtyards, perhaps on the walls themselves, looking out at the Roman camps below. The location does not matter. What matters is what was said, or what Josephus claimed was said. Here we must pause and acknowledge uncertainty. Josephus records 2 long speeches by Eleazar, elaborate orations that convinced the defenders to choose death over capture. The speeches are eloquent, philosophical, filled with references to Greek philosophy and ideas about the soul's immortality that seem oddly out of place in the mouth of a Jewish zealot. Many modern historians doubt their authenticity. Some argue Josephus invented them entirely, perhaps modeling them on his own experience at Jotapata, where he faced a similar choice and did not make it. Some suggest the speeches are Josephus's own thoughts, his wrestling with the question of whether he should have chosen death rather than surrender. Others argue that while the exact words are likely Josephus's reconstruction, the core message probably reflects what Eleazar actually said. Someone convinced nearly 1,000 people to commit an act that went against basic Jewish law. Someone framed the choice in terms that made the unbearable seem bearable. We cannot know the truth. We have only Josephus's account, written years later, for a Roman audience, by a man with complicated motivations. But the choice itself is historical fact. So let us consider what that choice entailed. The Romans would show no mercy. Rebel leaders would be executed publicly in Rome, strangled in the Tullianum prison after being paraded through the streets in Titus's triumph. They had already done this with other captured leaders from the war. The men of Masada knew their fate. The women and children would be enslaved, dispersed across the empire, sold in markets, property to be used as their owners saw fit. They would lose their names, their identity, their faith. Their children would grow up as slaves, never knowing freedom, never knowing their heritage. This was not speculation. This was certainty. Against that future, Eleazar reportedly offered an alternative. If they acted now, before the Romans entered, they could die free. They could die as Jews. They could deny Rome its final victory. Yes, Jewish law forbade suicide. Yes, what he was proposing was a sin. But was it not also a sin to allow themselves to become property, to let their children be raised as pagans, to see their wives abused by Roman masters? The debate must have been agonizing. Josephus claims that Eleazar had to speak twice, that after his first speech some still resisted. Only after a second oration, even more impassioned than the first, did the people agree. But agree to what exactly? Because suicide was forbidden, they devised a plan that technically avoided it, or tried to. The men would kill their families first. Then they would draw lots to select 10 among them who would kill the rest. Finally, those 10 would draw lots again to select one man who would kill the other 9 and then take his own life. Only one soul would be damned. The rest would die at the hands of others, preserving some technical compliance with religious law. It was a theological hair-splitting that speaks to the desperation of the moment. When agreement was reached, and we must imagine the tears, the protests, the anguish of those who resisted but were convinced, they set about their terrible task. Families gathered together. Husbands and wives, parents, and children. Fathers held their sons for the last time. Mothers kissed their daughters goodbye. The elderly embraced their grandchildren. And then, in acts that defy our ability to comprehend, they carried out what they had agreed to. Josephus describes the scene with a restraint that somehow makes it more powerful. He does not dwell on the physical details. He focuses instead on the emotional reality. The men, unable to watch their families suffer under Roman hands, yet tormented by having to act themselves. The terrible mathematics of the lots being drawn, the final man standing alone among the dead, surveying what they had chosen, and then kindling fires throughout the fortress before taking his own life. We will never know the exact details. Archaeological evidence is ambiguous. Some human remains were found at Masada, but not in the numbers Josephus describes, and their identification as defenders or victims is disputed. The pottery shards marked with names, including one reading Ben Yair, could be the lots Josephus mentions, or they could be something else entirely. But the broad outlines seem historically reliable. When the Romans entered Masada the next morning, they did not find a battle. They found silence and bodies, and a message written in the starkest possible terms. We will not submit. We will not be slaves. We will die free. Dawn's terrible silence. The Roman assault began at first light. Legionaries formed up at the base of the siege ramp, centurions checking formations, officers giving quiet commands. The siege tower had been pulled back during the night. Now soldiers would advance on foot through the breach, shields locked in the testudo formation, ready for the desperate final battle everyone expected. They climbed the ramp, reached the top, advanced through the burned opening where the wooden wall had been. Shields raised, swords drawn, every muscle tensed for the first clash of combat, and heard nothing. No war cries, no arrows whistling through the air, no clash of metal on metal, just silence, heavy and complete, pressing against the ears. The first soldiers through the breach must have been confused. They signaled to those behind. Advance, but cautiously. Something was wrong. They entered the fortress interior. Bodies, not scattered in battle, not fallen where they had fought, arranged, deliberately laid out. Families grouped together, men, women, children, the elderly. 960 people who had simply ceased to exist overnight. The Romans were hardened veterans. They had seen death in every form, on battlefields, in burning cities, in the aftermath of sieges and massacres. Death was their profession, their trade, their daily reality. But this was different. There had been no battle, no glory, no enemy to defeat, just silence and the evidence of a choice that defied comprehension. Josephus, our only source, claims that the Romans moved through the fortress in near silence themselves, awed by what they found. Some accounts suggest a few soldiers looted the bodies or storehouses, but most simply stood and tried to process what they were seeing. Then they heard voices. 2 women and 5 children emerged from hiding. They had concealed themselves in one of the underground cisterns, too afraid to participate in what the others had chosen. One of the women was related to Eleazar, perhaps his wife or another family member, and she told the Romans what had happened. She described Eleazar's speeches, the terrible debate, the drawing of lots, the implementation of what they had decided. She provided details that Josephus would later use in writing his account, though we cannot know how accurately he recorded her testimony. These 7 survivors were the only Jews the Romans captured alive from Masada. Silva, when informed, reportedly ordered his men to treat the bodies with respect, not out of mercy, the dead cannot feel mercy, but out of something else. Recognition, perhaps. A soldier's acknowledgement that these people, whatever else they were, had died rather than surrender. The Romans catalogued what they found, storehouses still full of food. Josephus specifically mentions this, emphasizing that the defenders had not been starved out, but chose death while still supplied. The cisterns still held water. Weapons were stacked neatly. Everything suggested a community that could have held out longer, but chose not to. The synagogue, the ritual baths, the ordinary tools of daily life. Signs that right up until the end, these were people trying to maintain their faith and their community under impossible circumstances. The pottery shards with names scratched into them were found, 11 in total, though whether these were actually the lots drawn or simply administrative records remains debated. One clearly reads, Ben Yair, Eleazar's name, or perhaps his father's. The Romans buried the dead, conducted their own religious rites, and began the task of establishing a permanent garrison. Masada had served its purpose as a symbol of rebellion. Now it would serve as a symbol of Roman control. But something had shifted. The Romans had won. They held the fortress. They controlled Judea. The Jewish revolt was comprehensively crushed. Yet their victory felt incomplete, hollow, in a way that other triumphs had not, because the defenders had written the final chapter themselves. They had denied Rome the satisfaction of capture, trial, and execution. They had chosen their own ending. In doing so, they had transformed defeat into something else, not victory. They were still dead, their cause still lost, but refusal. Absolute, uncompromising refusal to submit. That message would echo down through centuries, in ways neither Eleazar nor Silva could have imagined. Echoes through time, what Masada means. For 1,500 years after the siege, Masada was largely forgotten. Josephus's account preserved the story, but his works were read primarily by Christians, interested in the background of the New Testament, not by Jews seeking martyrdom narratives. The Talmud, which became the central text of rabbinic Judaism after the temple's destruction, barely mentions Masada. The rabbis who shaped Judaism's post-temple form were more interested in survival, adaptation, and the study of Torah than in celebrating a mass death. Masada slept in the desert, its stones slowly weathering, its chambers filling with sand, its story known but not central to Jewish identity. That changed in the 20th century. In 1927, a Hebrew poet named Yitzhak Lamdan published a work called Masada, using the fortress as a metaphor for the Jewish people's determination to survive. The poem's famous last line, "Masada shall not fall again," became a rallying cry for the Zionist movement building a Jewish state in Palestine. The timing was significant. European Jews faced rising anti-Semitism. The dream of a homeland in their ancestral land was gaining traction. The story of Masada, Jews choosing death over subjugation, resonated powerfully with a generation determined that never again would Jews be powerless victims. When Israel was established in 1948, Masada became a national symbol. Israeli soldiers would take their oath of service atop the fortress at sunrise, torches burning, voices echoing off the ancient stones. Masada shall not fall again. It represented everything the new state wanted to embody. Courage, resistance, the refusal to submit to overwhelming force. Then, in the 1960s, came the archaeological excavation. Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin led a massive dig at Masada between 1963 and 1965, employing thousands of volunteers from around the world. The goal was partly scientific, to understand the site's history, but also nationalist. Judean was not just an archaeologist, but a former chief of staff of the Israeli army. He understood the power of physical evidence to reinforce national narratives, and the excavation delivered. Herod's palaces were uncovered, remarkably preserved by the dry desert climate. The storerooms still contained food remnants. The ritual baths were intact. The synagogue, one of the oldest ever found, was identified. Roman siege works surrounded the site, exactly as Josephus had described. Most dramatically, pottery shards bearing names were found, including one reading, Ben Yair. Judean suggested these might be the actual lots drawn on that final night, though this interpretation remains controversial. Human remains were also discovered, though in far fewer numbers than Josephus's account would suggest, and their identification as defenders remains disputed. Regardless of the specific interpretations, the excavation made Masada real. It was no longer just a story in Josephus, but a place you could visit, touch, walk through. The Israeli government invested heavily in developing it as a tourist site. A cable car was built, the paths were improved, a museum was established. Today, 750,000 people visit Masada annually. But as the decades passed, something else happened. The uncomplicated, heroic narrative began to crack. Scholars pointed out that Josephus's account raises serious questions. He was not at Masada during the siege. His source was apparently one of the surviving women, but how accurately could she have known what was said and done? The elaborate speeches attributed to Eleazar contain Greek philosophical concepts that seem unlikely for a Jewish zealot to have expressed. The parallels to Josephus's own experience at Atop are suspiciously close. Some historians went further, questioning whether the mass suicide happened at all. Eric Klein and others have argued that the archaeological evidence does not support Josephus's narrative. Edward Luttwak suggested the Romans may have simply massacred the defenders, and that the suicide story was invented later. Most scholars, however, accept that something like what Josephus describes did occur, while acknowledging that the specific details, especially the speeches, are probably Josephus's reconstruction rather than verbatim accounts. More significantly, people began asking harder questions about the Sicarii themselves. Were they heroes or extremists? Freedom fighters or terrorists? The historical sources describe them assassinating not just Romans, but fellow Jews who disagreed with them, burning food supplies during Jerusalem's siege, massacring civilians at Ein Gedi. These are not the actions of simple heroes. Modern Israel has had to grapple with this complexity. In a nation built on the principle of never again being powerless, the story of Masada had powerful appeal. But in a nation also committed to democratic values and moral reflection, the uncritical celebration of the Sicarii became problematic. The debate about Masada thus became part of a larger debate about Israeli identity. Should the focus be on survival at any cost, or on the moral content of that survival? Is resistance always heroic, or does it depend on the methods used? What do we do with stories that inspire but also trouble us? These questions have no simple answers. What we can say with certainty is that Masada matters, not because everyone agrees on what it means, but because it forces us to confront difficult questions about freedom, resistance, sacrifice, and the choices people make when facing impossible odds. The defenders of Masada were not saints. They were not simple heroes. They were human beings who found themselves in a situation few of us can imagine, and they made a choice that cost them everything. Whether we call that choice noble or tragic, wise or misguided, does not change the fact that they made it. And in making it, they wrote themselves into history in a way that battlefield victories rarely achieve. Epilogue. The fortress still stands. Today, if you visit Masada, you can walk where they walked. The cable car carries tourists up the eastern side of the mountain, rising 1,300 feet in a matter of minutes. Or you can take the snake path, as pilgrims and soldiers did 2,000 years ago, switchback after switchback, in the building heat of the desert sun. Either way, you arrive at the summit out of breath and stepping into history. The ruins are extensive, remarkably preserved. Herod's northern palace still clings to the edge of the cliff, its 3 terraces visible, though their frescoes and mosaics are now protected behind glass and barriers. You can walk through the Western Palace's courtyards, seeing where kings once entertained, and where, centuries later, Jewish families made their final home. The storehouses are there, long chambers that once held enough food for years. The cisterns can be explored, though most are now empty, their ancient engineering still impressive. The synagogue sits in its casemate chamber, simple and moving in its plainness. The bathhouses showcase Herodian luxury, floor mosaics still intact after 2 millennia. And all around, visible from the walls, are the siege works. The Roman camps are still there, rectangular foundations clear against the desert floor. The circumvallation wall can be traced around the mountain's base. The siege ramp is still there, still usable, a testament to Roman engineering and the determination to leave no rebellion unpunished. Standing on Masada's walls, looking out at those siege works and beyond them to the Dead Sea, shimmering in the distance, you understand the isolation. The defenders could see everything approaching. They could count the Roman camps. They could watch the ramp being built. They knew, with absolute certainty, that there was no escape. And they stayed. The fortress is a UNESCO World Heritage Site now, protected for its historical and architectural significance. It draws visitors from around the world, Jews and non-Jews, Israelis and internationals, history buffs and spiritual seekers. Each person takes something different from the experience. Some see heroism, others see tragedy. Some see faith, others see fanaticism. Many see all of these at once, uncomfortably mixed, refusing to resolve into a simple lesson. Perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps the power of Masada lies precisely in its refusal to offer easy answers. The defenders were not modern people with modern values. They lived in a different world, faced different choices, operated with different assumptions about life, death, faith, and freedom. But their essential struggle, how to maintain dignity and identity in the face of overwhelming oppression, is timeless. Every generation that has faced subjugation, occupation, or tyranny has had to wrestle with similar questions. Submit or resist. Compromise or stand firm. Survive at any cost or accept death rather than betrayal of core beliefs. These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are life or death choices that real people in real situations must make. The defenders of Masada made their choice. It cost them everything. It changed nothing in the immediate tactical situation. Rome still won, Judea still remained conquered, the temple was still destroyed. Their deaths did not alter the course of history. And yet here we are, nearly 2,000 years later, still talking about them, still visiting their fortress, still wrestling with what they did and what it means. In that sense, perhaps they achieved something after all. Not victory in any conventional sense, not the political or military outcomes they fought for, but something else, a refusal to be forgotten, a declaration that some things matter more than survival, a choice that echoes across centuries, troubling and inspiring in equal measure. The fortress still stands, the stones still speak, and every person who climbs to its summit must decide for themselves what message they hear. Carrying the flame. Their names are mostly lost. We know Eleazar ben Yair. We know a handful of others from archaeological evidence and historical sources, but the 960 souls who stood on that mountain, most will never be named. Their individual stories, their hopes, their fears, the specific details of their lives, gone, consumed by time and tragedy. What remains is the choice they made. In the end, that is what matters, not the specific ideological disputes of the First Jewish-Roman War, not the tactical details of Roman siegecraft, not even whether we judge their decision as noble or misguided. What matters is that they faced the ultimate test, submit or die, and they chose death. They looked at Rome's overwhelming power, at the certain fate that awaited them, and they said, no. In a world that often rewards compromise, that celebrates practical accommodation, that counsels us to bend rather than break, There is something primal and powerful about that level of refusal. It speaks to something deep in the human spirit, the part that would rather break than bend, that values freedom more than life, that insists some things are worth dying for, even when dying changes nothing practical about the situation. We cannot all be Masada. Most of us will never face such stark choices. Most of us will live our lives making reasonable compromises, balancing ideals against realities, choosing survival and legacy over martyrdom. But we can remember them. We can remember that once, on a fortress in the desert, 1,000 people said no to the most powerful empire in the world. We can remember that they chose to write their own ending, rather than let it be written for them. We can remember that courage exists, that dignity matters, that the human spirit can be pushed to the edge of the abyss and still refuse to jump. Their fortress still stands in the desert, stones bleached by sun, walls worn by wind, but enduring. A monument to defiance, a memorial to those who would not kneel, a testament to the terrible price and the fierce beauty of refusing to submit. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, anger or admiration, sorrow or inspiration, discomfort or resolve, then their memory endures. If you found yourself questioning what you would do in their place, wondering whether you have that kind of courage or conviction, then they have reached across 2,000 years to challenge you. These are not just ancient stories. They are human stories, stories of people like us, thrust into circumstances beyond imagining, making choices that define not just their own lives, but echo through history. The next legend is waiting to be told. But first, remember this one. Remember Masada. Like and subscribe to keep these legends alive, because history is not about the past. It is about what we choose to remember, what we choose to honor, and what we choose to become. Stand with us. Share these stories. Let the flame of human courage and dignity never be extinguished, because Masada shall not fall again.